15 days ago, on an unremarkable Friday, my world began to shift in ways I didn't fully understand at the time. I was lying on the couch, scrolling through the gallery on my phone, revisiting the better days with Brian, my husband. The photos felt like fragments of a life that no longer existed. His warm, goofy grin in those images was now replaced by an exhausted, detached man who barely looked me in the eye anymore. It wasn't always like this. Brian used to light up at the mere mention of my ideas, especially when I'd suggest a bit of roleplay to spice things up. But lately, his excitement had dulled. "Not tonight," he'd mutter night after night, burying himself in his laptop. His excuses piled up, thin and predictable, until I could no longer see the man I'd married beneath them. Then, on a Sunday evening, Brian announced he had to leave for work. At 8 p.m. My boss called, he claimed. His tone so flat I almost believed him. But something inside me didn't. It was the way he avoided my gaze, the hurried way he buttoned his shirt. I decided then and there to follow him. I slipped on a jacket and walked a careful distance behind him, the brisk air biting my cheeks as I kept to the shadows. My heart was pounding, but I told myself I was being silly. 15 minutes later, he entered the office building, just as he said he would. Relief flooded me, he wasn't lying. But as I turned back toward home, shame tangled itself with that relief. Had I really let suspicion get the better of me? When I got home, I headed straight to the shower, scrubbing away the sweat from my little escapade. The warm water couldn't wash away the hollow feeling in my chest. Crawling into bed, I told myself I was overthinking. But when I woke up at 1 a.m. to an empty bed and no sign of Brian, the unease returned in full force. I grabbed my phone, dialing his number. It took 6 rings for him to pick up, his voice muffled by the background noise of music and laughter. Women's voices. My stomach twisted. "Where the hell are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling with anger. He stammered some excuse about working late, but the music in the background said otherwise. When he finally came home, I confronted him, my voice shaking with frustration. "Where were you?" I asked, my eyes burning into his. He shrugged it off, claiming he was in the office. That's when I knew he was lying. When I woke up, it was as if the frustration from the night before had been brewing in my chest, ready to explode. I couldn't hold it in anymore. Brian was standing in the doorway, his tie loose and his shirt wrinkled as if he'd spent the night running a marathon instead of working late. I sat up, my voice already trembling with anger. "Where the hell have you been?" I shouted, my voice slicing through the stillness of the early morning. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he stood there, motionless, his eyes heavy, his mouth set in a tight line. His silence only made the fire in me rage hotter. "Answer me!" I yelled, my voice echoing off the walls. For 10 minutes, I unleashed everything that had been building inside me. Every suspicion, every late night, every excuse he'd ever given me spilled out in a torrent of accusations. My voice cracked under the strain, my throat raw, but I didn't stop. My hands gestured wildly, slamming against the nightstand at one point, sending a glass of water tumbling to the floor. The shattering sound only spurred me on. Brian said nothing, not a word. He just stood there, his hands tucked into his pockets, his face unreadable. That calm indifference, like he couldn't be bothered to defend himself, drove me mad. Finally, my voice broke entirely, a hoarse whisper of its former strength. My chest heaved with the effort, but I'd run out of steam. I sat back on the bed, clutching the sheets in my fists, glaring at him. He stared at me for another moment, then turned and walked into the bathroom, closing the door softly behind him. It was infuriating how he could act so unaffected, like my rage was just a passing storm he could wait out. For the next week, Brian was on his best behavior. He came home every evening at 9 p.m. sharp, looking fresh and calm, as if to prove he was exactly where he was supposed to be. No mysterious calls, no whispered excuses about his boss needing him late. He even started asking me about my day, offering little gestures of kindness he hadn't bothered with in months. Almost worked. I began to doubt myself, wondering if I'd overreacted. Maybe the music I'd heard on the phone call was a coincidence. Maybe his late nights really were just work. By Saturday, I had almost convinced myself to trust him again. Almost. That evening, as we were lounging on the couch, Brian's phone buzzed. He reached for it quickly, glancing at the screen before standing up. "I'll be right back," he said, heading toward the bathroom. I noticed how careful he was not to look at me. I didn't think much of it until I heard the faint murmur of his voice behind the bathroom door. It wasn't unusual for Brian to take calls in private, but something about this one made my skin prickle. I crept closer, pressing my ear to the door. His words were low and hurried, impossible to make out, but the tone was enough to tell me this wasn't work. When he emerged, he avoided my gaze, busying himself with straightening his shirt. "That was my boss," he said, his voice a little too smooth. "Something urgent came up at the office. I have to go in." He didn't wait for my response. Grabbing his jacket, he headed for the door, calling back over his shoulder, "Don't wait up." But this time I wasn't going to let him get away with it. I threw on my own jacket, grabbed the spare key card to his office that I'd found weeks ago, and followed him out the door. My hands shook as I started the car, tailing him at a safe distance as he drove toward the office building. When he arrived, I parked down the block and waited. My heart hammered in my chest as I watched him disappear inside. He wasn't acting suspicious. He entered the building like it was any other night. But I wasn't buying it. After 10 agonizing minutes, I couldn't wait any longer. I stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at my skin as I made my way to the entrance. My fingers trembled as I scanned the keycard and stepped into the lobby. The building was eerily quiet, except for the faint hum of the elevator as it descended. I pressed the button for the 11th floor, my stomach churning as the doors slid shut. As the elevator climbed, I tried to steady my breathing. What was I about to find? Another late-night work session. Maybe a meeting. But deep down I knew better. The nagging doubt that had plagued me for weeks was now a full-blown certainty. The elevator dinged softly as it arrived at the 11th floor. The doors opened, and I stepped out into the hallway. That's when I heard it. Music. Loud and pulsing, the bass vibrating faintly through the walls. It wasn't the kind of music you'd expect to hear in an office. This was something else entirely. As I moved closer, I could hear voices. Women laughing, their voices light and teasing, mixed with the low rumble of men's conversations. I stopped just outside the door to the main office space, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might drown out the noise. My hand hovered over the handle, my fingers trembling. I wasn't sure I wanted to know what was on the other side. But I had to. I pressed myself against the cold metal of the door, straining to make sense of the voices spilling out from the room. Laughter, light, playful, mingling with deeper tones of conversation. Men and women, teasing, murmuring. The music throbbed softly in the background, sensual and inviting. My heart pounded against my ribs as I twisted the handle, the door creaking open just enough for me to slip inside. The sight that greeted me froze me in place. The room was bathed in low, amber lighting, the shadows flickering like something out of a dream, or a nightmare. Women lounged in nothing but their underwear, their bodies draped over plush couches and chairs. The men, also in their underwear, were scurrying around, their postures casual but deliberate. The air was thick, charged with something that felt wrong and intoxicating all at once. A salty tang hung in the air, a mix of perfume, sweat, and something heavier that made my stomach churn. I caught sight of someone lying on a couch, their bare back glistening as another figure leaned over them, hands working methodically in what looked like a massage. The low hum of conversation was punctuated by laughter, moans, and soft gasps. I blinked, unable to fully process what I was seeing. And then my eyes found him. Brian. My husband. My anchor. My betrayer. He was sitting on one of the low couches, a smirk plastered across his face. His shirt was unbuttoned, hanging open to reveal his chest, and his tie was slung lazily around his neck. Beside him was a woman I didn't recognize, draped over his lap like a cat, her hand trailing over his chest. Her laughter rang out light and flirtatious as Brian leaned closer, his hand gripping her thigh. For the first time in weeks he looked alive. His face, so weary and distant at home, was now alight with energy. He laughed with ease, his body language so natural, so smug. My heart clenched at the sight, a painful twist that left me breathless. He had never looked at me like that in months. Not even close. I couldn't move at first, rooted to the spot as I watched him play his little role in this grotesque theater. But then I heard him speak. "Oh yes," Brian said, his voice low and dripping with satisfaction. "You are much better than my wife." The words slammed into me like a blow. My vision blurred, red-hot fury overtaking my shock. Without thinking, without hesitation, I stepped forward, my heels clicking sharply against the floor. He didn't even notice me at first, too engrossed in his game to register the storm heading his way. When I reached him, I finally found my voice. "Oh, you fool!" I screamed, my words ringing out above the music and laughter. "This is what you do in the office." Brian froze, his smirk vanishing as he turned to face me. His face went pale, then flushed a deep red, the color of guilt and humiliation. The woman beside him jerked away, her hands flying up in surprise. The room fell silent, every head turning toward me in stunned disbelief. "You absolute bastard!" I shrieked, my voice cracking under the weight of my fury. I could barely hear myself over the rush of blood pounding in my ears. "This is what you've been doing while I've been waiting at home. You think this is acceptable?" Brian scrambled to his feet, fumbling to button his shirt. His movements were frantic, uncoordinated. His earlier composure shattered. "It's not what it looks like," he stammered, but the words were empty, hollow. "I wasn't listening. You said you were working late." "Working?" My voice rose with every word raw and sharp. "But this is what you've been doing. Cheating. Lying. With her." I gestured wildly toward the woman, who was now backing away, her face a mask of embarrassment. Chaos erupted around me. People were moving, speaking, trying to calm the storm I had unleashed. Hands reached out to grab my arms, to pull me back, but I fought them off. "Don't touch me!" I screamed, yanking myself free from their grasp. The room was a blur of faces, some shocked, others amused, a few irritated by the interruption. But I didn't care. My entire focus was on Brian, who stood there, avoiding my eyes, his hands fumbling with his clothes. He didn't say a word, didn't try to defend himself. He just stood there, his face a mix of shame and something else. Fear, perhaps, or annoyance. "Say something," I demanded, my voice raw. "Defend yourself. Explain this. Anything." But he didn't. He couldn't. He just looked at me, his face crimson, his hands trembling as he zipped his pants. The silence stretched, suffocating and damning. And then, without thinking, I lunged at him. "You coward!" I yelled, my hands reaching for his shoulders. "How dare you humiliate me like this?" I didn't know what I intended to do. Push him, shake him, anything to make him react. But before I could reach him, the crowd pulled me back, their hands firm and restraining. "Calm down, miss," someone said, their tone infuriatingly patronizing. "You're causing a scene." "A scene?" I spat, twisting in their grasp. "You think this is a scene? This is my life." Brian finally looked at me, his eyes wide, pleading. "Please," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Not here. Not here." I repeated, laughing bitterly. "You've got some nerve." The hands holding me loosened, and I wrenched myself free. My chest heaved, my heart racing as I glared at Brian one last time. The room felt stifling, the air thick with shame and betrayal. Without another word, I turned and stormed out, the sound of my heels echoing behind me. When I had said everything, I just spat at my husband Brian and left the office. I felt a rush of emotions flooding me, each one worse than the last. anger, hurt, disbelief. I wanted to lash out, to scream at him, but nothing came out except for words I could never take back. Those were the words that ended us. Those were the words that shattered everything we had built. I couldn't stay another second in that room with him, the man I had trusted, the man I had loved. I couldn't breathe in the same space anymore, so I left. I slammed the door behind me and didn't look back. I didn't even care to check if he was running after me, if he was calling me, if he had anything to say. His betrayal was too much. I was numb to the sound of his voice by now, sickened by the realization of what I had seen with my own eyes. His lies, his deceit. I walked to my car and drove home in silence, the engine humming louder than my thoughts. Once I arrived, the house felt different. Foreign. As if everything that had ever mattered inside those walls had been taken from me. The memories, the laughter, the promise of forever. All of it now felt like a lie. I didn't even know where to begin. I couldn't look at anything. Not the pictures of us hanging on the walls. Not the mementos of our vacations, the gifts we had exchanged. Everything felt like a reminder of his betrayal. I headed straight to our bedroom. The one place where we had shared so much. It was supposed to be our sanctuary. But now it was filled with nothing but sorrow. My hands shook as I started gathering the photographs we had taken over the years. Our wedding pictures, vacations, birthdays. The life we had built. I ripped them apart one by one. I couldn't look at them. How could I? They had been tainted by the knowledge that he had been unfaithful. They weren't memories anymore. They were reminders of what he had done. Each tear in the paper felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders, but the pain still remained. I couldn't stay there, not with everything feeling so wrong, so broken. I stuffed my bag with the essentials, clothes, a few things I couldn't live without. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay in that house, not with him, not with those memories. Had to get away. As I packed, my phone kept buzzing. It was him. Brian. I didn't want to answer. Couldn't. What could he say? I had seen it with my own eyes. How he had cheated on me. How he had betrayed everything we had worked for. His words would mean nothing. I silenced the phone and threw it into my bag, then turned on my heel and headed out of the house. I got into my car and started driving, not knowing where I was going but needing to get as far away from everything as possible. Every mile I drove was a step farther from the life I once knew. The pain was unbearable, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep going. I needed to clear my head, to make sense of what had happened. But the more I thought, the more I realized that nothing made sense anymore. My mind kept replaying the images I had seen, the moment I had walked in on him and her. How could he do this to me? How could he betray everything we had built together? The thought of it twisted in my stomach, a constant ache that I couldn't shake off. I drove faster, hoping that the road would somehow take me to peace, but it didn't. When I reached my parents' house, I was a wreck. I didn't even know how to explain what had happened. How could I tell them that the man I had married, the man I had trusted with my heart, had betrayed me in the worst way possible? My mother opened the door and immediately saw the devastation in my eyes. She didn't ask any questions. She just pulled me into a hug, holding me tight as if trying to shield me from the pain. We sat down and I told her everything. How I had caught him, how he had lied to me for so long. My words spilled out in a jumble, but somehow I felt a little lighter after sharing it with her. She listened, didn't interrupt, just let me speak. She was the rock I needed at that moment. "I'm so sorry, sweetie," she said, her voice filled with compassion. "I know this is hard, but you're going to get through this. You're stronger than you think." I didn't feel strong. Felt broken. I felt like I was drowning in my own grief. But her words, her presence, gave me a little comfort. I wasn't alone in this, at least. 15 days have passed since then. 15 days of crying, of trying to make sense of everything. Still hurts every single day. The images of what I saw haunt me, and I still wonder if I'll ever be able to truly forgive him. I don't know. But I'm trying to move on. I'm trying to heal. Life goes on, even when it feels like everything has been shattered. Thank you for listening to my story. I wrote it not just for me but for you too. I want you to learn from it, to see that trust is fragile, and once it's broken, it's hard to repair. But no matter what happens, you have to keep moving forward. Don't let betrayal define you. You are worth so much more than that. Thank you for everything.